They laughed at a homeless Navy SEAL's stone tower, until one frozen night his dog became their only chance to survive. Title: They mocked a homeless Navy SEAL's stone tower. His dog saved them when cabins froze. The first Arctic wind swept across Montana weeks before winter was supposed to arrive. While the people of Cold Creek stacked firewood and trusted their cabins, a homeless former Navy SEAL named Ethan Walker hauled stone onto a lonely ridge. They called him crazy. They mocked his tower. But as the snow deepened and a deadly storm descended from the mountains, only one soul seemed to understand what was coming: his loyal K9, Ranger. Comment 1 if you would trust your instincts, or 0 if you would trust the crowd. And tell us where you're watching from. The first hard frost arrived 3 weeks earlier than usual in the Bitterroot Mountains. It crept down from the high peaks during the night and settled over the valley of Cold Creek like a warning nobody wanted to hear. By dawn, every pasture shimmered silver. Every fence rail sparkled beneath a thin layer of ice. The ranchers noticed. The hunters noticed. The old-timers sitting outside Maggie's diner noticed. And every one of them reached the same conclusion. Winter was coming early, again. Throughout the valley, people moved with urgency. Chainsaws growled from dawn until sunset. Pickup trucks hauled firewood. Barn doors were reinforced. Generators were tested. Families stacked supplies inside garages and sheds. No one wanted to be caught unprepared in western Montana once the mountain passes closed, especially not in Cold Creek, because Cold Creek sat in a bowl surrounded by wilderness. When storms arrived, they stayed. When snow came, roads vanished. And when temperatures dropped far below zero, help could be days away. Preparation wasn't optional. It was survival. That was why people couldn't stop staring at the ridge west of town. Because while everyone else was preparing for winter one way, one man was doing something that made absolutely no sense. Every morning before sunrise, a tall figure appeared along the barren ridge overlooking the valley. He pushed an old wheelbarrow loaded with stone. Trip after trip, hour after hour, day after day. The man was Ethan Walker, 42 years old, former Navy SEAL, former husband, former homeowner, former everything. Now most people simply called him the homeless veteran on the ridge. His dark beard had grown longer since summer. Gray streaks had begun creeping into it. His weathered jacket looked older than some of the ranch hands working below. And yet, despite the rough appearance, there was something about Ethan that made people uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way he constantly scanned the horizon. Maybe it was how he noticed everything. Or maybe it was because his eyes carried the weight of things most people couldn't imagine. Whatever the reason, Cold Creek never quite knew what to do with him. Especially after he started building the tower. The structure sat on a rocky rise nearly half a mile above town. At first, people assumed it was a foundation. Then they thought it might become a storage shed. But as the weeks passed, the shape became stranger. Round, massive, made entirely of stone. No visible chimney, very few openings, walls thicker than any cabin in the valley. The more it grew, the less sense it made. And the more people talked. You see that thing he's building? He'll freeze to death before Christmas. Man's gone crazy. War finally got to him. The comments spread through town like wildfire. Most were spoken quietly. Some weren't. Ethan heard many of them. He never responded. He simply kept hauling stone. His only companion was Ranger. The German shepherd rarely left his side. At 8 years old, Ranger still carried himself with military precision. His thick black and tan coat was beginning to show hints of gray around the muzzle. His ears remained alert. His amber eyes missed nothing. When Ethan worked, Ranger watched. When Ethan slept, Ranger stood guard. And whenever people laughed at the tower, Ranger seemed to remember every face. One cold October morning, Ethan guided another wheelbarrow up the steep slope. The load contained nearly 300 pounds of stone. His shoulders burned, his lower back ached, but he kept pushing. At the top of the ridge, Ranger waited beside the growing wall. The dog stood facing north, perfectly still studying the distant mountains. Ethan noticed. "You hear something, buddy?" Ranger didn't move. A gust of wind swept across the ridge. The dog's ears twitched slightly. Then he relaxed. Ethan smiled faintly. "Thought so." The two of them returned to work. Below, Cold Creek was waking up. Smoke rose from chimneys. School buses rolled along icy roads. Pickup trucks headed toward ranches. Life moved normally. Yet from the ridge, it all felt distant. Like Ethan was watching another world. A world he no longer belonged to. Months earlier, he'd arrived in town with little more than an old truck, a double bag, and Ranger. Nobody knew much about him. Some said he was running from debt. Others claimed he'd lost everything after returning from war. A few insisted he'd simply lost his mind. The truth was far more complicated. But Ethan never explained himself. The less people knew, the easier things seemed. Near noon, he drove into town for supplies. The truck rattled loudly as it rolled down Main Street. Cold Creek wasn't much more than a few blocks. A diner, a gas station, a hardware store, a church, a school, and enough people to know everyone else's business. As Ethan parked outside Dawson Hardware, conversations paused. Not completely, just enough. The same thing happened every time he appeared. People watched, whispered, wondered. Ranger jumped from the truck and walked beside him. The dog's presence usually discouraged direct confrontation. Usually. Inside the hardware store, Ethan gathered masonry nails, mortar mix, and heavy work gloves. At the register, he heard a familiar voice. "You still building that castle?" The speaker was Mason Crowley, Cold Creek's most respected builder. Tall, broad-shouldered, confident, the kind of man people listened to. Mason leaned against a display of winter tools. Several customers nearby turned to listen. Ethan set the supplies on the counter. "It's not a castle," Mason chuckled. "Could have fooled me." A few people laughed. "You know what I think," Mason continued. "I think you're spending all that effort building your own freezer." More laughter. Ethan remained silent. Mason shook his head. "Stone doesn't keep people warm. Never has. Still nothing." The silence irritated Mason more than an argument would have. Finally, Ethan looked at him. Just once, calmly. "Winter will tell us." The store fell quiet. Not because the words were dramatic. Because of how he said them. Like he already knew something everyone else didn't. Mason snorted. "Winter always tells us." Ethan picked up his supplies. Ranger followed. Neither looked back. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner, honest. Ethan loaded the truck. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he noticed Ranger staring through the windshield. Toward the mountains again. Always the mountains. The dog seemed increasingly interested in them lately. Ethan filed the observation away. Ranger rarely paid attention to anything without reason. The drive back to the ridge was quiet. Clouds gathered over the distant peaks. Snow clouds, too early, far too early. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to work. Stone after stone, layer after layer. The tower slowly climbed higher. Its curved walls now reached chest height. The structure cast a long shadow across the ridge. Ranger lay nearby, watching. The sun sank lower. Golden light spilled across the valley. For a brief moment, Cold Creek looked peaceful, almost fragile. Ethan stopped working. His gaze drifted toward town. Families would soon gather for dinner. Children would finish homework. Lights would appear in windows. Simple things. Normal things. Things he hadn't experienced in years. A familiar sadness settled over him. Not sharp, not overwhelming. Just present, like an old scar. Ranger rose and walked over. The dog rested his head against Ethan's leg. No barking. No whining. Just contact. The simple reminder that he wasn't completely alone. Ethan scratched behind Ranger's ears. "You always know." The dog looked up at him. For a moment, the loneliness eased. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. Cold air rushed into the valley. Night arrived quickly. Ethan lit a lantern beside his weather-beaten canvas shelter. The tent looked small against the growing tower. Temporary. Fragile. The opposite of the structure he was building. Most people couldn't understand why he slept there instead of inside a cabin. Most people couldn't understand a lot of things. Inside the tent, he unrolled a map. Old notes covered the margins. Wind directions, temperature records, elevation measurements, observations collected over months. Ranger settled beside him. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted silently through the darkness. Ethan noticed them immediately. Too early, again. The storm wasn't supposed to arrive for another week. He stepped outside. The valley below glowed softly beneath scattered lights. Above, clouds swallowed the stars. The wind carried a different scent tonight. Colder, sharper, almost metallic. Ranger emerged from the tent and stood beside him. Both stared north, toward the mountains, toward the darkness, toward something neither town nor valley could yet see. The dog suddenly stiffened, not aggressively, not fearfully. Alertly, his ears locked forward, his entire body became still. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing. Only darkness. Only mountains. Yet Ranger refused to look away. Seconds passed, then a minute. Finally, the dog relaxed. But the feeling remained. Something was coming. Ethan didn't know exactly what. Not yet. But standing there on the lonely ridge with snow drifting around them, he felt the first whisper of unease. Below, Cold Creek slept peacefully. Above, winter was already moving through the mountains. And on the ridge overlooking it all, a homeless Navy SEAL continued building a stone tower. Everyone believed would fail. Everyone except one dog. And perhaps, deep down, Ethan himself. Because while the town laughed at what they could see, neither Ethan nor Ranger could stop thinking about what was still hidden beyond the peaks. The real winter hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming, and when it did, Cold Creek would discover why the man on the ridge had never been building a tower. He had been preparing for a test, but long before the storm, long before the tower, long before Cold Creek, another mountain had changed Ethan Walker forever. The nightmare always began the same way. Darkness, snow, wind, and voices. Ethan woke suddenly. His entire body jerked upright inside the canvas shelter. His breathing came hard, fast. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The tent walls seemed too close, the darkness too familiar. His pulse thundered inside his ears. Then he heard a familiar sound, a low whine, gentle, concerned. Ranger. The German shepherd was already awake. The dog had moved beside Ethan's sleeping bag and rested his head across Ethan's knee, grounding him, pulling him back. Ethan closed his eyes, slowly, carefully. The nightmare began to fade. The mountain disappeared. The gunfire vanished. The screams became silence. Only the cold Montana night remained. "You got me again, buddy." Ranger's tail thumped softly against the ground. Outside, the wind whispered across the ridge. Inside the shelter, Ethan sat awake for a long time. Sleep rarely stayed once the memories arrived. The old military watch on his wrist showed 3:17 a.m. 3 hours until sunrise. 3 hours until work. 3 hours until he could stop thinking. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. The cold hit immediately. Sharp, clean, honest, unlike memories. The valley below slept beneath a blanket of darkness. Only scattered porch lights glowed in the distance. Cold Creek looked peaceful from here. Small, safe. The kind of place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. Ethan knew better. Bad things could happen anywhere, especially in mountains. He stared toward the northern peaks. Snow already covered the highest ridges. Moonlight painted them silver, beautiful and dangerous. Ranger emerged from the shelter and sat beside him. Neither moved, neither spoke. Some silences didn't need filling, especially between old soldiers, because Ranger remembered too. Not the details, not the names, but the fear, the cold, the loss. Animals remembered differently. Yet Ethan often wondered whether the dog carried ghosts of his own. The following morning arrived beneath gray skies. Frost coated every stone on the ridge. Ethan started work before sunrise. The routine never changed. Mix mortar, move stone, measure alignment, repeat. The physical labor helped. It always helped. As long as his body hurt, his mind remained quiet. That was one reason he kept building. Most people assumed the tower was about survival. Only partly. It was also therapy. Every stone gave him something solid to focus on, something real, something that couldn't vanish overnight. By mid-morning, Ranger was helping in his own way. The dog trotted around the construction site, inspecting every corner, watching every movement. Twice he alerted Ethan to loose stones near the edge of the foundation. Another time, he barked sharply when a section of scaffolding shifted unexpectedly. The dog seemed determined to supervise the entire project. "You know," Ethan said, setting another stone into place, "you're becoming a worse foreman than any chief petty officer I ever served under." Ranger tilted his head. Ethan laughed quietly. One of the rare, genuine laughs. The dog wagged his tail. Those moments mattered, because there had been a time when Ethan thought he might never laugh again. After the military, after the hospital, after the funerals, everything had become gray, months blurred together. Some days he barely left his apartment. Other days he drove for hours, simply to avoid being alone with his thoughts. Eventually, the apartment disappeared. Then the job. Then the routine. Only Ranger remained. The dog had followed him through every collapse, never questioning, never judging, never leaving. Around noon, Ethan drove into town for supplies. Cold Creek bustled with preparation. Snow tires, propane deliveries, wood splitting. Everyone seemed busy except the group gathered outside Maggie's diner. The same group that always watched him arrive. As Ethan exited the truck, conversations slowed. Ranger stepped out beside him. The German Shepherd immediately noticed every face, every movement. Years of military training never truly disappeared. Inside the diner, warmth wrapped around him. Coffee aromas filled the air. The lunch crowd was busy. Ranchers, truck drivers, teachers, people with lives moving forward. Ethan ordered black coffee and a sandwich, nothing more. He sat alone near a window, just the way he preferred, at least until a small voice interrupted. "Can I pet your dog?" Ethan looked up. A boy stood beside the table. About 10 years old, dark hair, curious eyes, a winter coat slightly too large for him. Ranger looked at the boy, then at Ethan. "Waiting, always waiting." Ethan nodded. "Only if he says yes." The boy blinked. "How do I know?" "You ask." The boy crouched carefully. "Can I pet you?" Ranger sniffed his hand, then stepped forward, tail wagging, permission granted. The boy grinned instantly. A real grin. The kind children only gave when something genuinely made them happy. The dog's reaction surprised Ethan. Ranger rarely warmed up to strangers so quickly, especially children. "His name's Ranger," Ethan said. "I'm Caleb." The boy scratched behind the dog's ears. "He likes you." "I like him too." A woman approached from across the diner. She carried a nurse's jacket draped over one arm. Her expression balanced caution and gratitude. "Caleb," the boy looked up. "Sorry, Mom," she smiled. "It's okay." Then she turned toward Ethan. "I'm Hannah Brooks." "Ethan, I know." There was no judgment in her voice, no pity, just recognition. That alone felt unusual. Most people in town already knew who he was, the homeless veteran, the tower builder, the local mystery. Hannah wasn't looking at him that way. She was simply talking to another person. "Thank you for being patient with him," she said. "No problem." Caleb continued petting Ranger. The dog seemed perfectly content. For a few moments the conversation remained simple, comfortable, almost normal. Then Hannah noticed Ethan's bandaged hand. "Construction accident?" "Stone slipped." She nodded. "Occupational hazards." Nothing more. Yet Ethan noticed something in her eyes. She recognized old injuries, the scars, the posture. Perhaps years as a nurse had taught her to see things others missed. When she and Caleb eventually left, Ranger watched them go. The dog seemed oddly interested, especially in the boy. Ethan made a mental note of it. Outside, snow flurries drifted through the air. Too early again. As he loaded supplies into the truck, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. A mountain, a helicopter, blinding snow, someone shouting. The image hit hard, fast. His breathing tightened. The familiar pressure returned. The beginning of another episode. Not here, not now. He gripped the truck door, focused on the cold metal beneath his fingers, focused on the present, focused on Montana, not the past. A wet nose touched his hand. Ranger, the dog, had already noticed. Of course he had. Ethan exhaled slowly. The panic retreated. Not gone, never gone, just pushed back. The drive to the ridge passed in silence. Clouds gathered above the mountains, heavy clouds, the kind that carried snow. Work continued until dusk. Stone after stone, the tower grew taller, stronger, more permanent. As darkness approached, Ethan climbed onto the unfinished wall and surveyed the valley. Cold Creek glowed below. Tiny lights scattered through the landscape, families preparing dinner, children doing homework, lives unfolding, normal lives. He wondered what that felt like now. Not surviving, living. The thought lingered longer than he wanted. Later, inside the shelter, Ranger curled beside the sleeping bag. The dog seemed restless tonight. His ears twitched repeatedly. Listening, watching, waiting, Ethan noticed. "What is it?" Ranger lifted his head. The dog stared toward the north wall of the tent, toward the mountains again. Always the mountains. For nearly a minute he remained frozen, focused, then finally relaxed. Strange, very strange. Ethan made another note of it. Outside, snowflakes drifted silently across the ridge. The first real accumulation of the season. Winter was moving closer, and something else seemed to be moving with it. That night, sleep finally came. Briefly, uneasily, the nightmare returned before dawn. The mountain, the storm, the mission. The moment everything went wrong. This time the memories arrived sharper than before. Ethan heard the wind. He saw whiteout conditions swallowing the world. He heard his teammates calling over the radio. Then silence. Terrible silence. The kind that never truly left. Suddenly he was awake again, gasping, disoriented. The panic hit harder than usual. His hands shook. The tent walls seemed to close around him. His vision blurred. The old fear surged forward. For one dangerous moment he looked toward the tower outside. Half-finished, flawed, uncertain. What if Mason was right? What if everyone was right? What if he was building a monument to his own failure? What if the war had finally broken him? The thoughts spiraled rapidly, darkly, dangerously. Then Ranger moved. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply climbed onto the sleeping bag and pressed his entire weight against Ethan's chest. Firm, steady, present. Like an anchor, like a lifeline. Slowly the panic began to break. The tent returned. The ridge returned. Reality returned. Ethan wrapped both arms around the dog. Neither moved for several minutes. Outside, the first real winter wind swept across the mountain ridge. Inside the shelter, one soldier quietly saved another again. And somewhere beyond the northern peaks, hidden beyond darkness and distance, a storm was already beginning to form. Neither Ethan nor Ranger knew its name yet, but both could feel it coming. The following week settled over Cold Creek beneath a sky that never seemed fully blue. Clouds lingered. The wind changed directions more often than usual, and the mountains remained hidden behind curtains of gray. Most people barely noticed. Life continued. Wood piles grew. Ranchers repaired fences. School buses rattled along frozen roads. The town moved forward with the comfortable confidence of people who believed they understood winter. Ethan kept building. Every sunrise found him on the ridge. Every sunset left him exhausted. The tower now stood nearly 8 feet tall. Its curved walls had begun attracting even more attention. From a distance, it looked strange against the landscape. Not like a cabin, not like a barn, not like anything people expected. The structure seemed almost ancient, as though it belonged to another place and another time. That alone was enough to make people talk. By midweek, nearly everyone in Cold Creek had an opinion about the tower. And most of those opinions weren't kind. Inside Maggie's diner, conversations often turned toward Ethan. The morning crowd gathered around steaming coffee mugs while snow flurries drifted outside. He'll be lucky if that thing lasts until January. I heard he's sleeping in a tent beside it. Man's got to be freezing. You don't build houses from stone in Montana. Heads nodded around the room. Agreement came easily when the target wasn't present. Then the front door opened. The bell jingled, and Ethan walked in. The room didn't become silent, but it became quieter. People glanced away. Others stared openly. Ranger padded beside him. The dog's calm confidence often made people uncomfortable, especially when he looked directly at them. Ethan ordered breakfast and sat alone near the window. Just like always. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily across Main Street. Inside, whispers resumed. A few tables away, Mason Crowley sat with several contractors and ranchers. The builder watched Ethan for a moment before shaking his head. I still don't understand why nobody tells him. One of the ranchers frowned. Tells him what? That he's wasting his time. A few men chuckled. Mason took a sip of coffee. Winter doesn't care about dreams. The comment drew agreement. Then Mason stood, coffee cup in hand. He crossed the room. Ethan saw him coming. Ranger did too. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly, watching, measuring, waiting. Mason stopped beside the table. You know, he began casually. I was thinking about your tower. Ethan continued eating. Mason smiled. Actually, I think everybody's thinking about your tower. Several nearby customers laughed. Ethan remained silent. That seemed to encourage Mason. I've built homes in this valley for 20 years. He leaned slightly closer. Every winter teaches the same lesson. Still no response. Mason shook his head. Stone freezes. Ethan finally looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment the diner seemed quieter. You keep saying that, because it's true. Ethan set down his fork. No, the answer surprised everyone, including Mason. The builder's smile faded slightly. Ethan's voice remained calm, controlled. Cold isn't what kills people. Several people nearby listened carefully now. Mason folded his arms. Then what does? Heat loss. The room remained silent. Ethan returned to his breakfast. Conversation over. Or at least it should have been. But Mason wasn't finished. Well, I guess we'll see who understands winter better. Ethan nodded once. We will. The builder walked away. The moment ended. Yet something about Ethan's certainty lingered long after he left. Outside, Hannah Brooks had witnessed part of the exchange through the diner window. She stood beside her truck after finishing a nursing shift. Caleb sat inside waiting. Mom, she glanced toward the passenger seat. Yeah? Why does everybody make fun of him? Hannah followed her son's gaze. Ethan was loading supplies into his truck. Ranger stood nearby, watching, always watching. I don't know, Caleb frowned. He seems nice. Hannah smiled faintly. Sometimes people make decisions about someone before they know them. The boy looked back toward Ethan. That's not fair. No, she started the engine. It isn't. Up on the ridge, Ethan worked until darkness arrived. The tower continued rising, stone by stone, layer by layer. The physical labor helped quiet his thoughts, at least temporarily, because whenever work stopped, memories returned, especially at night, especially when snow began falling. One evening, while carrying another load of stone, Ethan froze unexpectedly. The sound had lasted less than a second. A helicopter, far away, almost invisible against the clouds, yet it was enough. His muscles tightened immediately. His pulse accelerated. For a brief moment, Montana vanished. The ridge vanished. Cold Creek vanished. Another mountain appeared. Another storm. Another mission. Another disaster. Ethan. The voice wasn't real. Only memory. But it sounded real enough. His breathing quickened. World narrowed. The familiar spiral began. Then Ranger barked sharply once, loud, direct. The sound snapped through the fog inside Ethan's mind. He blinked. The ridge returned. The tower returned. Reality returned. Ranger stood only a few feet away, watching him, concerned. The dog slowly approached and nudged Ethan's hand, grounding him again. Ethan exhaled heavily. Thanks, buddy. The episode passed, but the exhaustion remained. Some battles never truly ended. That night, a fresh snowfall covered the ridge. White drifts gathered around the unfinished tower. Moonlight reflected across the landscape. The structure appeared larger now, stronger, more permanent. Ranger circled it twice before settling near the entrance. Guard duty, as always. The next morning brought another surprise. Caleb Brooks appeared on the ridge. Alone, at least for the moment. The boy climbed carefully through the snow, carrying a paper bag. Ranger spotted him first. His tail immediately began wagging. Ethan noticed. Well, look at that. Caleb grinned. I brought sandwiches. Ethan blinked. For who? For both of you. The boy held up the bag. My mom made extra. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. Not pain, something else. Something unfamiliar. Kindness. Simple. Uncomplicated. The sort of thing he'd almost forgotten existed. Thank your mom. I will. Caleb immediately moved toward Ranger. The dog greeted him enthusiastically. Soon the two were sitting beside the tower, sharing part of a sandwich. Ethan watched quietly. The sight felt strangely comforting, almost normal. For the first time in months, laughter echoed across the ridge, not from people mocking him, but from a child playing with a dog. For a few minutes, the loneliness felt smaller. Far below, however, another set of eyes watched from town. Mason Crowley. The builder stood outside a supply warehouse loading materials. His gaze drifted toward the ridge, toward the tower, toward the veteran who refused to quit. The structure bothered him more than he wanted to admit, not because he feared it might fail, because part of him wondered what would happen if it succeeded. The thought irritated him. He dismissed it immediately. No, winter would settle the argument. Winter always did. Days continued passing. Snow came more frequently. The mountains vanished behind storms. And yet Ethan's tower continued growing. By late November, it had become impossible to ignore. Travelers slowed their vehicles to look at it. Hunters pointed toward it. Children asked questions about it. The tower had become Cold Creek's favorite topic, and Ethan had become its favorite joke, at least for now, because while the town laughed at the man on the ridge kept preparing. And every night, Ranger continued staring toward the northern mountains. Longer, more often, more intensely. The dogs seemed to be listening for something still beyond human hearing. Something moving through the wilderness. Something drawing closer. The townspeople saw only an unfinished stone tower. Ranger seemed to see something else entirely. And before long, Cold Creek would learn that the dog had been paying attention to the right thing all along. December arrived under a sky the color of steel. The mountains surrounding Cold Creek disappeared behind layers of cloud that seemed permanently attached to the peaks. Snow covered the higher slopes now, transforming the bitter roots into towering walls of white and gray. Winter had not fully arrived, but it was standing at the door. Every morning, Ethan Walker climbed from his canvas shelter before dawn. Every morning, Ranger was already awake. The German shepherd never needed an alarm. Long before sunlight touched the ridge, he would rise, stretch, and begin his patrol around the tower. The behavior had become so routine that Ethan barely thought about it anymore, at least until he noticed something unusual. Ranger wasn't simply walking the perimeter. He was inspecting it. The dog moved slowly around the structure, stopping at certain points, sniffing carefully, studying corners and openings with remarkable attention. Sometimes he would stand motionless beside a section of wall. Other times he would paw at the ground. It was almost as if he were conducting his own inspection. One freezing morning, Ethan watched the dog circle the tower 3 separate times. Finally, Ranger stopped near the northern side of the structure and barked sharply. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" The dog pawed at the snow. Ethan walked over. At first he saw nothing, then he noticed it. A small gap between 2 stones, barely visible, the kind of flaw most people would never see. Cold air was slipping through it. Not much, but enough. Ethan knelt immediately. A slow smile crossed his face. Good catch. He patched the gap before noon. The incident stayed with him, because it wasn't luck. Ranger had identified a genuine weakness, and it wasn't the first time. 3 days later, the dog discovered another problem. This time, it involved the temporary scaffolding surrounding the tower. The structure had survived several storms already, but strong winds were becoming more common. That afternoon, Ranger refused to leave one corner of the scaffold. He barked repeatedly, not aggressively, urgently. Ethan climbed up to investigate. A support brace had loosened. One more heavy windstorm might have brought the entire section crashing down. Again, Ranger had noticed first. You trying to build this thing yourself? Ethan asked. The dog's tail wagged. For a moment, Ethan laughed. A genuine laugh. The sound surprised him. It had become rare enough that even Ranger looked pleased. Meanwhile, word of the tower continued spreading through Cold Creek. People still mocked it, but curiosity had begun replacing some of the ridicule. Travelers passing through town often stopped to ask about the strange round structure on the ridge. Hunters pointed it out from distant roads. Even children had started talking about it. Most adults dismissed the tower. The younger generation found it fascinating, especially Caleb Brooks. The 10-year-old had become a regular visitor. Every few days, Hannah drove him up the ridge after school. Officially, he came to help. In reality, he came to spend time with Ranger. The dog greeted him enthusiastically every time. One afternoon, Caleb arrived carrying a tennis ball. The moment Ranger saw it, his ears perked up. "Think he wants to play?" Caleb asked. Ethan smirked. Only one way to find out. The ball flew across the snowy ridge. Ranger exploded after it. For the next 20 minutes, the German Shepherd transformed from disciplined military veteran into a playful dog. Caleb laughed constantly. The sound echoed across the mountains. Ethan found himself watching quietly. Something about the scene felt important. A child, a dog, simple happiness. The kind of thing war never prepared you for. Hannah noticed Ethan watching. "He's good with kids." Ethan glanced toward Ranger. "He's good with people." "Not always." "No." Ethan smiled faintly. "Only the right ones." Hannah laughed softly. For a moment, the conversation felt natural, easy. Neither mentioned PTSD. Neither mentioned homelessness. Neither mentioned the tower. Just two adults watching a boy and a dog play in the snow. The normalcy felt strangely valuable, almost healing. As the weeks passed, winter deepened. Snow arrived more frequently. The ridge became harder to work on. Yet Ethan continued building. So did Ranger, because the dog truly seemed to view the project as his responsibility. Every day he watched. Every day he inspected. Every day he stood guard, especially at night. That behavior became impossible to ignore. Most evenings, Ranger would settle near the tower entrance, facing north, watching the mountains. Hours could pass without movement. The dog remained alert, silent, focused. One evening, Ethan finally sat beside him. The temperature had dropped sharply. Stars glittered overhead. Cold Creek glowed far below. The valley looked peaceful, almost magical. Ranger stared toward the northern peaks. Again, always the same direction. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing moved, no lights, no wildlife, no sound, just darkness. "What are you seeing?" The dog didn't answer, of course. But something about his posture made Ethan uneasy. The feeling lingered. Days later, another strange incident occurred. Ethan was working inside the tower when Ranger suddenly rushed through the doorway. The dog barked sharply, then ran outside, then barked again. Confused, Ethan followed. Ranger led him 50 yards from the structure. Only moments later, a section of loose stone broke free from the upper wall and crashed into the exact spot where Ethan had been standing. The impact shook the ground. Dust exploded into the air. Silence followed. Ethan stared, then slowly looked at Ranger. The German Shepherd simply stood there, watching him, waiting, as if making sure he was okay. A chill ran through Ethan, not because of the cold, because Ranger had somehow known, maybe not consciously, maybe not intentionally, but the dog had sensed danger before it happened. Again. That night, Ethan gave Ranger an extra portion of food. The dog accepted it proudly, a well-earned reward. Far below in town, however, not everyone shared Ethan's appreciation. Mason Crowley remained openly critical. The builder had grown increasingly irritated by the tower's continued existence. Every week it stood was another week his predictions failed. The structure wasn't collapsing. It wasn't freezing. It wasn't abandoned. It was growing. One evening inside Maggie's diner, Mason voiced his frustration. "You know what's funny?" Several men looked up. "What?" Mason pointed toward the ridge visible through the window. "Everybody's acting like that dog is building the thing." Laughter followed. "Maybe he is. Probably smarter than his owner. More laughter. The jokes spread quickly. Cold Creek loved a good story, and the image of a German shepherd supervising a stone tower proved irresistible. Yet, beneath the humor, something was changing. People were paying attention, whether they admitted it or not, because the tower was no longer just a curiosity. It had become part of the landscape, part of Cold Creek, and every day it survived, made people slightly less certain of their assumptions. Meanwhile, Ranger continued watching the mountains. The behavior intensified. Sometimes he ignored food until after sunset. Other times he stood motionless for nearly an hour, listening, waiting, studying. Even Ethan couldn't explain it. One particularly cold night, snow began falling heavily. The ridge disappeared beneath blowing white curtains. Visibility dropped. Wind howled across the valley. Most people stayed indoors. Ranger didn't. The dog stood outside the tower entrance, facing north, refusing to come inside. Snow accumulated across his back. Still he remained. Ethan finally stepped outside. Ranger. The dog didn't move. Come on. Nothing. Only after several more moments did Ranger reluctantly return to the shelter. Even then, he seemed reluctant to stop watching, as if abandoning his post. That night, Ethan lay awake longer than usual. The wind battered the canvas walls. Snow rattled against the fabric. Beside him, Ranger slept lightly. Even in sleep, his ears twitched. Always alert, always listening. Eventually, Ethan closed his eyes. But one thought remained. The dog wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't reacting to random sounds. Ranger was expecting something. Something beyond the mountains. Something still far away. And whatever it was, the dog had already begun preparing for it, long before anyone else, including Ethan. The first true test arrived on a night when the wind came screaming out of the north. It began shortly after sunset. At first, it sounded like distant traffic moving through the mountains. Then it grew louder and louder, until the entire ridge seemed surrounded by invisible freight trains. Ethan stood outside the tower, studying the dark sky. Snow blew sideways across the landscape. The temperature was falling rapidly. Even Ranger seemed uneasy. The German shepherd paced the perimeter instead of sitting at his usual post. His ears remained alert. His eyes never stopped moving. Something about the storm felt different, more aggressive, more determined. The kind of weather Ethan remembered from survival operations in remote mountain ranges. Weather that punished mistakes. Weather that exposed weaknesses. And tonight, the tower still had weaknesses. The structure was nearly finished. Nearly, but not quite. The roof was incomplete. Several internal systems still required adjustment. And the northern ventilation channels had yet to be fully tested. Ethan knew all of that. Unfortunately, winter didn't care. The storm struck before midnight. The first gust hit like a hammer. The unfinished tower groaned. Snow blasted across the ridge. Loose materials tumbled through the darkness. Inside the structure, Ethan lit a lantern and continued working. He wanted to secure several interior sections before conditions worsened. Ranger followed him closely. The dog seemed unwilling to let Ethan out of sight. Hours passed. The wind intensified. Then it happened. A deep roar echoed through the tower. At first, Ethan thought it was thunder. Then came another sound, a rushing sound, a terrible sound, smoke. The lantern flame suddenly flickered. Air pressure shifted violently. Before Ethan could react, thick smoke exploded backward through one of the ventilation passages. The tower filled instantly. Dark clouds rolled across the interior. Ash swirled through the air. Visibility vanished. Ethan coughed. His eyes burned. The smoke moved far faster than it should have. Something was wrong, very wrong. Ranger, the dog barked immediately. The sound came from somewhere inside the haze. Ethan dropped to one knee. Military training took over. Stay low, find clean air, move. The smoke thickened. Every breath became harder. For one terrifying moment, panic threatened to surface. Not fear of the storm, fear of failure. The tower wasn't supposed to do this. He had calculated everything, measured everything, planned everything. Yet winter had already found a flaw. Ranger appeared through the smoke. The dog pushed against Ethan's leg, guiding him, leading him toward the doorway. Together they stumbled outside. The freezing air hit like ice water. Ethan collapsed onto one knee, coughing, gasping. Snow covered his shoulders within seconds. Ranger stayed beside him. The German Shepherd never left, even as smoke continued pouring from the structure behind them. For several minutes, Ethan simply sat in the snow, watching, thinking, listening. The storm howled around him. The tower stood silent. And for the first time since beginning construction, doubt entered his mind. Real doubt. Not the kind planted by Mason Crowley. Not the kind whispered by strangers. His own doubt, the dangerous kind. Because the truth was obvious. If smoke could reverse during this storm, worse problems could follow. Heat loss, structural stress, airflow failures, mistakes. The tower wasn't ready. Not yet. And winter wasn't waiting. Ranger nudged his shoulder. The dog seemed concerned. Ethan looked at him, then back toward the structure. Most people would have blamed the storm. Ethan blamed himself. The design wasn't wrong. The execution was incomplete. There was a difference. And if he ignored it, people could die someday, including him. The next morning revealed the damage. Snow covered the ridge. The storm had passed. The sky looked clear again, almost innocent. The tower stood intact. But inside, evidence of failure remained everywhere. Soot covered the stone walls. Ash blanketed the floor. The ventilation system clearly required changes. Ethan spent the entire day investigating, measuring, testing, adjusting. Ranger followed every step. By evening, Ethan discovered the problem. A northern pressure channel had created an unexpected reverse draft during extreme wind conditions. The flaw was subtle, almost impossible to predict, but winter had found it anyway, just as it always did. 3 days later, another problem appeared. This one worried Ethan even more. The snowpack surrounding the tower had begun melting unevenly. At first, the change seemed harmless. Then he noticed moisture beneath part of the stone floor, tiny droplets, barely visible, yet enough to trigger concern. He knelt for nearly 20 minutes studying the area. His stomach tightened. Moisture was dangerous. Not immediately, but over time. Especially in deep winter. Especially when temperatures plunged far below zero. If water became trapped beneath the structure, the consequences could be serious. The realization haunted him, because he had already solved drainage issues during construction, or so he believed. Apparently not completely. By the end of the week, another issue emerged. A hairline crack, small, thin, almost invisible, running along part of the foundation. Ethan discovered it shortly after sunrise. He stared at it for several seconds, then longer. The crack wasn't catastrophic, not yet, but it represented something worse. Proof. Proof that the tower wasn't perfect. Proof that nature had found another weakness. Word spread quickly. Cold Creek loved bad news, especially when it involved the tower. By afternoon, conversations filled Maggie's diner again. I heard it's cracking already. Told you stone doesn't belong up there. Mason was right. The stories grew larger with every retelling. Meanwhile, Ethan worked harder than ever. Yet the harder he worked, the more exhausted he became. Sleep disappeared, stress increased, and the old memories began returning more frequently. One evening, after nearly 16 hours of repairs, Ethan sat alone inside the unfinished tower. Snow drifted quietly outside. The valley lights flickered below. Everything felt distant. The crack had been repaired. The airflow system redesigned. The drainage modified. Yet uncertainty remained. For the first time since arriving in Cold Creek, he wondered if everyone else might be right. Maybe the project was impossible. Maybe the tower would never perform as intended. Maybe he had spent months chasing an idea that belonged in the past. His thoughts darkened. The familiar spiral began. Failure, regret, doubt, the same enemies he'd battled for years. Finally, Ethan stood. Without thinking, he walked away from the structure, toward the shelter, toward the truck, toward escape. Maybe he should leave. Maybe it was time. The tower wasn't finished. The town hated it. Winter was winning. What was the point? Halfway across the ridge, he stopped. Something felt wrong. Too quiet. He turned. The tower stood alone against the snow-covered landscape. Moonlight reflected off the stone walls. For a moment, it looked abandoned. Then he saw Ranger. The German shepherd lay inside the unfinished doorway, perfectly still, watching him. The dog wasn't following, wasn't moving, wasn't leaving. Ranger had chosen the tower, the structure Ethan was ready to abandon. Snow gathered across the dog's back. Still he remained, guarding it, believing in it. Ethan stared for a long time. The message felt unmistakable. The dog wasn't protecting Stone. He was protecting Ethan's purpose. The thing keeping him moving forward. The thing keeping him alive. Slowly, Ethan walked back. Ranger's tail wagged once. Only once, but it was enough. "You stubborn old dog." The German shepherd stood and walked over. Ethan knelt beside him. For several moments, neither moved. The wind whispered across the ridge. Snow drifted around them. The tower remained unfinished, flawed, imperfect, but still standing, just like the man building it. And somewhere beyond the northern mountains, winter continued gathering strength, waiting, testing, searching for weaknesses, because the real storm had not arrived yet. These failures were only warnings. The true challenge was still coming. And when it came, everything Ethan believed about the tower would finally face judgment. The first sign appeared in the animals. At least, that was how Ethan understood it. 3 days after the storm that nearly convinced him to abandon the tower, he noticed something strange while gathering stone near the edge of the forest. The birds were gone, not completely, but enough to matter. The ridge usually echoed with the sounds of chickadees, jays, and mountain sparrows throughout the day. Now there was silence, an unnatural silence, the kind experienced hunters paid attention to, the kind soldiers learned not to ignore. Ethan stood quietly beside a stand of pines. Snow drifted gently around him. Ranger sat nearby, watching the mountains, as always. The dog had become even more focused during the previous week. Some nights he barely slept. Other nights he paced around the tower until sunrise. At first Ethan blamed the weather. Now he wasn't so sure. "What are you trying to tell me, buddy?" Ranger looked north. The answer never changed. The mountains. Always the mountains. That afternoon, Ethan climbed onto the nearly completed tower roof. The view stretched for miles. White valleys, frozen rivers, dark forests, towering peaks, beautiful. But something felt wrong. The clouds were behaving strangely, moving too fast at higher elevations. Pressure systems were shifting in ways he remembered from military forecasting briefings. Patterns he had not seen in years. Not since Alaska. Not since the deployment that haunted his dreams. His stomach tightened. The sensation was immediate. Instinct, experience, memory. Call it whatever you wanted. Something dangerous was developing. And it was coming from the north. Over the next several days, Ethan began recording observations. Wind speed, temperature swings, cloud movement, snowpack changes. The notes filled an old weatherproof notebook he carried everywhere. The same notebook that once contained military survival calculations. Each new observation deepened his concern. Then Ranger stopped eating. Not entirely, but enough to notice. The German shepherd normally attacked every meal with enthusiasm. Now he often left food untouched until evening, sometimes longer. His attention remained fixed elsewhere, toward the distant mountains, toward something no one else seemed capable of seeing. One evening, Ethan placed a bowl of food beside him. Ranger barely looked at it. The dog simply sat facing north, alert, still, listening. The behavior lasted nearly an hour. Finally, Ethan crouched beside him. "What is it?" The dog didn't move. A cold wind swept across the ridge. Ethan followed Ranger's gaze again. Nothing. Yet the feeling returned. That same uneasy feeling growing stronger every day. The next morning, he drove into town. Cold Creek was preparing for Christmas. Lights decorated storefronts. Wreaths hung from windows. Children hurried through fresh snow with sleds and scarves. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Ethan parked outside the feed store. Inside, several ranchers discussed weather forecasts over coffee. Most predicted a cold winter. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Ethan listened quietly, then he made a decision. By noon he had visited nearly every business owner in town. The responses were similar: confused, polite, skeptical. Some listened, most didn't. Finally, he stopped at the weekly town planning meeting held inside the community hall. Nearly 30 residents had gathered: ranchers, store owners, teachers, volunteers, and Mason Crowley. The builder sat near the front, confident as ever. When Ethan entered, several conversations immediately stopped. People knew him, and they knew he rarely attended meetings. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Well, this is new." A few people laughed. Ethan ignored it. The mayor nodded politely. "Need something, Ethan?" "Yes." The room grew quieter. Ethan stepped forward. He wasn't comfortable speaking publicly. Never had been. But some things mattered more than comfort. "I think a major storm is coming." Silence followed. Several people exchanged glances. The mayor frowned. "What kind of storm?" "A bad one." Someone chuckled softly. Ethan continued. "I've been tracking pressure changes and weather patterns for weeks." Mason leaned back in his chair. Already smiling, Ethan saw it, ignored it. "The conditions aren't normal." The mayor folded his arms. "What are you recommending?" "More supplies." A few people nodded. "Reasonable enough." "Backup fuel." More nodding. "Emergency shelters." Now the room looked confused. Mason laughed openly. There it was, the reaction Ethan expected. "Emergency shelters?" Several others joined the laughter. The builder stood. "Ethan." His tone sounded patient, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "You think we're about to face the apocalypse." More laughter. Ethan remained calm. "No, then what?" "A storm stronger than people expect." Mason shook his head. "And how exactly do you know that?" The room waited. Ethan glanced briefly toward Ranger. The dog sat quietly beside the doorway, watching everyone. "I've seen conditions like this before." Mason smirked. "Military intuition?" "No." "Then what? Experience." The answer changed nothing. Mason spread his hands dramatically. "Folks, we live in Montana." More laughter. "We've all seen storms." Several people nodded. The builder continued. "Every year someone predicts disaster." The room relaxed. People smiled again. The tension disappeared. Exactly as Mason intended. Then came the comment Ethan would remember later. "Maybe you've been spending too much time alone on that ridge." A few people laughed harder. Others looked uncomfortable. But nobody defended him. Not openly, not yet. Even Hannah Brooks remained silent. She sat near the back of the room, concerned, uncertain. She trusted Ethan more than most. Yet even she struggled to believe a disaster was approaching. After all, Cold Creek had survived countless winters. What made this one different? The meeting ended without action. No emergency preparations, no additional planning, nothing. The town chose normalcy. Ethan left quietly. Ranger followed. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the air. The evening sky glowed orange behind distant clouds. Beautiful. Deceptively beautiful. "You tried." The voice came from behind him. "Hannah." Ethan turned. She stood near the entrance, holding her coat tightly against the cold. "They don't believe me." "No, they should." She studied him carefully. For a moment, Ethan expected sympathy. Instead, she asked something else. "Do you really think it's that serious?" The question mattered, because Hannah wasn't mocking him. She genuinely wanted to know. Ethan looked toward the mountains. The peaks had vanished again, hidden behind another wall of cloud. "Yes." The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. Something in his voice unsettled her. She could hear certainty, not paranoia, not fear, certainty. "I hope you're wrong, so do I." The two stood silently for several seconds. Then Hannah nodded and walked away. That night, Ethan returned to the ridge. The tower was finally nearing completion. Only minor adjustments remained. The structure stood strong against the snow-covered landscape. Its thick stone walls reflected moonlight. Its shape looked almost ancient, timeless. Ranger immediately resumed his post, facing north, watching. Hours passed. The temperature dropped rapidly. Sometime after midnight, Ethan woke suddenly, not from a nightmare, from silence, complete silence. No wind, no birds, No movement. The world felt frozen. He stepped outside. The stars above looked unusually sharp, the air painfully cold. Ranger stood near the edge of the ridge, rigid, alert. His ears pointed toward the mountains. The dog hadn't moved. Ethan joined him. Together they stared into the darkness. Then something happened. Ranger growled. Low, quiet. The first true growl Ethan had heard in months. Not aggression, warning. The sound sent a chill through him, because Ranger never wasted energy, never reacted without reason. The dog had sensed something real, something approaching. Far beyond the mountains, far beyond Cold Creek, the storm still had no name, but it was coming. And every instinct Ethan possessed told him the town had just made a terrible mistake. The next morning arrived beneath a strange sky. The sun rose, but it never truly appeared. A pale glow filtered through layers of high clouds, turning the entire valley silver and gray. Cold Creek looked frozen in place. Even the air felt different, heavier still, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Ethan stood outside the tower, with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. Beside him, Ranger stared toward the northern peaks. The dog had barely slept again. Dark circles had begun forming beneath Ethan's eyes as well. Not from fear, from preparation. Over the previous week, he had doubled his efforts. Every weakness discovered during construction had been addressed. Every crack repaired. Every airflow problem redesigned. The tower now stood complete. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Ethan looked at it and felt confidence. Not pride. Confidence. The thick stone walls curved around the central chamber like a protective shell. The ventilation channels functioned correctly. The thermal floor system worked. The structure felt alive, ready. But readiness only mattered if people listened, and Cold Creek wasn't listening. That morning, Ethan drove into town again, not to convince them. He already knew that battle was lost. Instead, he bought supplies, every supply he could afford: propane canisters, medical kits, water containers, canned food, blankets, fuel. The cashier at Dawson Hardware raised an eyebrow as item after item piled onto the counter. Expecting company? Ethan shook his head. Just preparing. The cashier laughed lightly. For what? Ethan didn't answer, because he was tired of explaining. Outside, Ranger sat beside the truck, watching people move through town. Children walked towards school. Ranchers loaded feed. Delivery trucks arrived. Everything looked normal. Yet Ethan noticed things others missed. Birds flying lower than usual. The unusual quiet. The absence of wildlife movement near the tree line. Small details. Tiny warnings. Nature often spoke softly before it screamed. By noon, word had spread that Ethan was stockpiling supplies. Predictably, the rumors began. Inside Maggie's diner, conversations erupted. I heard he's preparing for some kind of disaster. He thinks we're all going to freeze. Maybe he's building a bunker now. Laughter followed. As always. Mason Crowley sat near the counter listening. The builder shook his head. He spent too much time alone. Someone nodded. War changes people. Mason sipped his coffee. Maybe. Then he looked toward the ridge visible through the diner window. The tower stood clearly against the snowy landscape. Silent, unmoving, persistent. Something about it irritated him, more than he wanted to admit. Because despite every prediction, it remained standing. Despite every warning, Ethan kept building. And despite the ridicule, he never argued. Never defended himself. Never fought back. The quiet confidence bothered Mason more than anger ever could. Across town, Hannah Brooks found herself increasingly uncertain. That afternoon, she watched weather forecasts while finishing paperwork at the clinic. The reports seemed routine, nothing alarming. Yet something kept bothering her. Ethan's certainty. The memory returned repeatedly. I hope you're wrong. So do I. The way he had answered. The way he hadn't hesitated. People who wanted attention usually exaggerated. Ethan never did. That was what unsettled her. When her shift ended, she drove toward the ridge. Caleb sat beside her, excited as always. Think Rangers outside? Probably. The boy smiled. Good. By the time they arrived, snow had begun falling lightly. The tower looked impressive now. Finished. Solid. Almost beautiful. Caleb immediately jumped out. Ranger greeted him before his boots even touched the ground. The German shepherd's tail wagged enthusiastically. For a few moments the world felt normal again. Child dog. Simple happiness. Meanwhile, Hannah found Ethan stacking emergency supplies inside the tower. More supplies than she expected. Far more. Blankets lined one wall. Water containers filled another. Medical kits sat neatly organized near the entrance. The sight stopped her. You really think it's coming? Ethan looked up. Yes, no hesitation again. She glanced around. This seems like a lot. It might not be enough. The answer sent a chill through her. Not because of what he said, because he believed it, completely. For several moments neither spoke. Then Hannah noticed something else. The tower felt warm, not hot, warm despite the cold outside. She pressed a hand against one of the interior stone walls. The surface retained heat surprisingly well. Ethan noticed. It's working. You tested it? Every day. She nodded slowly. The structure suddenly seemed less strange, less impossible, and more practical. The realization unsettled her, because if Ethan was right about the tower, what else might he be right about? Meanwhile, outside, Caleb played fetch with Ranger. The dog seemed happier than he had been in weeks, at least temporarily. Then something changed. Midway through a game, Ranger froze, completely. The tennis ball rolled through the snow unnoticed. The dog wasn't looking at it. He wasn't looking at Caleb. He wasn't looking at Ethan. His eyes locked onto the northern mountains. Instantly, the change was dramatic. Caleb noticed first. What's wrong? Ranger didn't move. His ears stood straight up. His body became rigid, alert, focused, watching. A cold wind swept across the ridge. Snow lifted from the ground in swirling ribbons. For nearly 30 seconds, the dog remained frozen. Then he growled softly. The same low warning Ethan had heard the previous night. Hannah looked toward the mountains. What is he seeing? Ethan's expression darkened. I don't know, but he had a feeling, and that feeling continued growing. As December progressed, Cold Creek ignored every warning. Life went on. Christmas lights appeared. Holiday events filled calendars. Families prepared celebrations. The storm became an afterthought, a joke, nothing more. Even after temperatures dropped faster than usual, even after winds strengthened, even after strange weather patterns emerged, the valley remained confident. Pride is a comforting thing, especially when everyone shares it. By Christmas week, Ethan had stopped trying to convince anyone. He focused entirely on preparation. The tower became his world. Every system was checked repeatedly. Food supplies expanded. Emergency sleeping areas were organized. Firewood stacked neatly beneath protective coverings. Ranger supervised everything. The dog seemed determined to inspect every corner, every wall, every entrance, as though preparing for guests. One evening, while carrying supplies into storage, Ethan noticed something unexpected. The wildlife was disappearing. Not just birds, everything. Deer sightings dropped dramatically. Coyotes vanished. Even rabbit tracks became rare. Animals were moving, leaving, seeking shelter. The realization sent a chill through him. Nature knew. Nature always knew first. That night he climbed onto the tower roof. The view stretched across the valley. Cold Creek glowed with Christmas lights. Beautiful, peaceful, unaware. Above the town, clouds gathered over the northern mountains. Massive clouds, dark clouds. The kind that swallowed entire horizons. Ranger stood beside him, watching, always watching. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. For several minutes they stood together in silence. The wind continued strengthening. Far away beyond the peaks, something enormous was building. Something neither forecasts nor townspeople fully understood. And down below, Cold Creek continued preparing for Christmas, not survival, because the valley had made its choice. The town chose comfort over caution, normalcy over preparation, pride over warning. And as Ethan stared toward the darkening mountains, he realized something painful. The storm was no longer the greatest danger. The greatest danger was that no one believed it existed. 3 days before Christmas, the first warning arrived. Not from the weather service, not from a radio broadcast, from the temperature. Ethan noticed it immediately. The thermometer mounted outside the tower dropped 18 degrees in less than 6 hours. That shouldn't have happened. Not this fast, not under normal conditions. The air itself felt wrong, dry, sharp, almost metallic. The kind of cold that seemed to strip warmth from skin before the wind even touched it. Ranger sensed it too. The dog spent most of the day outside, watching, waiting, refusing to wander far from the tower. By sunset, the northern sky had turned dark gray, not storm gray, something heavier, something deeper. Clouds stacked above the mountains like walls, massive, silent, unmoving. Ethan stood on the ridge and stared at them for a long time. The sight reminded him of combat, not because of violence, because of inevitability. Some events could still be prevented, others could only be survived. This storm belonged to the second category. That night, Cold Creek celebrated the beginning of Christmas week. Families gathered. Church choirs practiced. Children talked about presents. The diner stayed open late. Warm light spilled across snowy sidewalks. The town felt alive, comfortable, safe. No one imagined that within 48 hours everything would change. The next morning, the wind arrived. Not strong, not yet, just steady. A constant push from the north. By afternoon it had strengthened. By evening it never stopped. The trees along the valley floor swayed continuously. Snow drifted across roads. Livestock became restless. Even ranchers began noticing. Still, nobody panicked. Cold Creek had seen wind before. The real change came during the night. Around 2 in the morning, Ethan woke to a sound unlike anything he had heard since arriving in Montana. The tower hummed, not loudly but clearly. Wind pressure moved across the curved stone walls, creating a low vibration throughout the structure. Ethan sat up immediately. Ranger was already awake. The dog stood near the doorway, listening. Outside, snow raced through the darkness. The storm had arrived, and it was accelerating. By dawn, visibility had dropped dramatically. The mountains disappeared completely. Roads vanished beneath drifting snow. The temperature plunged another 15 degrees. The forecast finally caught up. Emergency weather alerts began appearing across radio stations. Arctic front, dangerous conditions, travel not advised, potential record lows. For the first time, Cold Creek paid attention. But by then, the storm was already in control. At the Brooks house, Hannah listened to the weather reports while preparing breakfast. Caleb sat quietly beside the window, watching the snow. "Think Ranger's okay?" Hannah smiled faintly. "Ranger's probably worried about everyone else." The boy grinned. That sounded exactly like the dog. Outside, however, conditions worsened rapidly. Snow accumulated faster than crews could clear it. County plows struggled. Visibility continued dropping. By afternoon, the main highway leading out of the valley was closed. Then came the first power outage. A transformer failed near the eastern edge of town. Several homes lost electricity. Repairs became impossible. The wind was too strong, the snow too heavy. People started realizing this storm wasn't ordinary. Still, most remained confident. They had wood, generators, supplies, cabins. Everything would be fine. Or so they believed. High above the valley, Ethan continued preparing. Additional blankets, extra firewood, emergency water. The tower had become a fortress. The thick stone walls absorbed heat steadily. The thermal floor system functioned perfectly. For the first time since construction began, everything worked exactly as intended. Yet Ethan found little comfort in that, because he kept looking down toward Cold Creek, and every time he did, the same thought returned. They aren't ready. As evening approached, Ranger suddenly became agitated. The dog paced constantly, back and forth, back and forth. He checked every entrance repeatedly, every window, every corner. The behavior reminded Ethan of military working dogs before missions, focused, alert, expecting trouble. Then Ranger did something unusual. He walked to the tower entrance and began staring toward town. Not the mountains, the town. His attention remained fixed there. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" The dog whined softly. The sound carried urgency, concern. Ethan followed his gaze. Snow obscured most of the valley. Only scattered lights remained visible. Nothing looked wrong, yet Ranger refused to look away. Hours later the answer arrived, the first emergency call. Not officially. Cold Creek wasn't equipped for that kind of system. Instead, the news spread person to person, neighbor to neighbor, house to house. A family near the southern edge of town had lost heating. Their generator failed. Their backup fuel froze. Temperatures inside the home dropped rapidly. Fortunately, relatives arrived before the situation became dangerous. The family relocated. Problem solved, or so people thought. Then another generator failed. Then another. Then another. The storm wasn't simply bringing snow. It was bringing extreme cold. A level of cold most residents had never experienced. Machines stopped functioning properly. Fuel thickened. Engines struggled. Water lines froze. The valley began changing. By the second day, the crisis became impossible to ignore. Temperatures dropped below 0, then below 10, then lower still. The wind transformed every exposed surface into ice. Doors froze shut. Vehicle batteries died. Livestock shelters collapsed beneath drifting snow. Throughout Cold Creek, people burned more firewood than expected. Far more. The cold consumed heat relentlessly. Cabins required constant attention, constant fuel, constant effort. Inside Maggie's diner, conversations no longer focused on Ethan's tower. They focused on survival. How much wood remained, which roads were open, who still had power. The mood had changed significantly. Even Mason Crowley looked concerned. The builder sat near the window, watching snow hammer the street outside. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression. Because his own cabin was struggling. The wood stove burned continuously, yet temperatures inside continued falling. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to notice. Enough to worry. That evening, he returned home carrying additional firewood. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The air felt colder than it should. His wife sat near the stove, wrapped in blankets. "What's happening?" She looked up. "The fire won't keep up." Mason frowned. "Impossible." He approached the stove. The fire blazed normally. Plenty of fuel. Plenty of heat. Yet somehow the warmth wasn't staying inside. The cabin was losing the battle. Slowly, steadily. The realization unsettled him. Because Ethan's words returned. Heat loss. Cold isn't what kills people. Heat loss does. Mason pushed the memory away. But not entirely. That night became the coldest of the year. Then the coldest in several years. And the storm wasn't finished. At midnight, Ethan stepped outside the tower. The wind hit immediately. Brutal, merciless. The valley below had nearly disappeared. Only scattered lights remained visible through the snow. Some homes were already dark. Power outages continued spreading. Ranger stood beside him, watching, listening, waiting. The dog suddenly lifted his head, his ears locked forward. Toward town again. A low whine escaped his throat. Then another. The behavior felt different this time. More urgent, more personal. As if the danger he had sensed for weeks was finally arriving. Not in the mountains, not beyond the peaks. Here now, inside Cold Creek itself. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. Together they stared into the storm. Below them, the valley fought desperately against the cold. And for the first time, Ethan realized something terrifying. The storm wasn't even at full strength yet. By dawn, Cold Creek had disappeared. Not literally, but from the ridge, the valley looked as though it had been erased from the earth. White, endless white. The blizzard swallowed roads, fences, vehicles, and landmarks beneath drifting snow. Visibility dropped to less than 100 feet. The mountains vanished completely. The world had become a storm. Inside the tower, the air remained steady and warm. The thick stone walls quietly held heat from the previous night's fire. The floor radiated gentle warmth upward. Everything Ethan had built was working exactly as planned. Yet he couldn't relax, because Ranger couldn't relax. The dog had not settled down once, not for a minute. He paced continuously between the doorway and the northern windows. then toward the southern side, then back again, watching, listening, waiting. The behavior had become impossible to ignore. Something was wrong. Around mid-morning, Ethan heard faint radio chatter from an emergency weather broadcast. The signal faded in and out through the storm. Record low temperatures. Travel impossible. Remain indoors. Then silence. The radio died again. The storm was overwhelming communications. Ethan stared at the snow outside. The valley had become isolated, completely. Anyone in trouble would be largely on their own. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Several hours passed. The wind continued increasing. The tower occasionally shuddered beneath powerful gusts. Yet it held, strong, stable, reliable. Then Ranger stopped moving. Instantly, the dog froze beside the entrance. Every muscle tightened. His ears pointed toward town. His eyes widened. Ethan recognized the look immediately. Military working dogs displayed it when detecting something important. Something urgent. "What is it?" Ranger barked. Once, sharp, then again louder. The dog ran to the doorway, then back toward Ethan, then to the doorway again. The message was unmistakable. "Come now." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Show me." The moment the words left his mouth, Ranger launched into the storm. The German Shepherd disappeared into the blowing snow. Ethan grabbed his winter gear and followed. Outside, the cold hit like a physical force. Wind hammered against him, snow stung his face. Visibility barely extended beyond a few yards. Only Ranger's dark shape remained visible ahead. The dog moved with purpose, not randomly, not searching, leading. Ethan trusted him completely. That trust had been earned years earlier, on battlefields, on mountains, during moments when hesitation meant disaster. The two pushed downhill toward Cold Creek. Progress was slow. The storm fought every step. Snowdrifts reached knee-height, in some places higher. Several times Ethan nearly lost sight of Ranger. Yet the dog always reappeared, waiting, making sure he followed, then continuing forward. Halfway to town, Ranger suddenly changed direction. He veered toward a cluster of trees near an abandoned service road. The dog accelerated. Something was there. Ethan followed. Moments later, he found it. A pickup truck, almost completely buried. Only part of the cab remained visible. The vehicle had slid off the road during the storm. Ethan's heart sank. He rushed forward. Ranger was already scratching at the driver's side door. Inside sat an elderly rancher named Walter Jensen, alive, but barely. Walter's eyes opened weakly as Ethan reached him. Relief flooded the old man's face. His voice cracked. Thought nobody was coming. Ethan worked quickly. The truck heater had failed. Walter had been trapped for hours, perhaps longer. Without Ranger, no one would have found him. The storm had hidden everything. Together they helped Walter out of the vehicle. The rancher could barely stand. Ranger remained beside him, almost guarding him. Once Walter was stable enough to move, Ethan pointed toward town. "Head for the church shelter." Walter nodded, then looked at Ranger. "Good dog." The German Shepherd wagged his tail once, then immediately turned toward the storm again. Not finished. Not even close. The rescue continued. Ranger led Ethan deeper into the valley, through drifting snow, past frozen fences, past abandoned roads. Every few minutes the dog would stop, listen, then choose another direction, always with purpose, always certain. At one point he located a stranded couple trapped inside a disabled SUV. At another he led Ethan to a ranch hand, struggling to reach a barn through waist-deep snow. Again and again, the dog found people. The storm tried to hide them. Ranger found them anyway. Word began spreading. The veteran and his dog were moving through the blizzard, helping whoever they could reach. For the first time since the storm began, people stopped laughing about Ethan Walker, and they stopped laughing about the tower, because now those things seemed unimportant. Survival was all that mattered. By late afternoon, exhaustion had begun catching up with Ethan. The cold drained energy quickly. The constant effort of moving through snow became punishing. Yet Ranger never slowed. The dog seemed driven by something deeper than training. A sense of duty, a mission, a purpose. the same purpose Ethan once carried. As daylight faded, the storm intensified again. Visibility worsened. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing. Most people had already taken shelter. Only a few remained unaccounted for, including someone Hannah Brooks desperately wanted to find, Caleb. The realization struck Ethan moments after he reached the Brooks house. Hannah opened the door before he could knock. Terror filled her face. The expression alone told him something was wrong. Caleb's gone, the words hit hard. What? He left. Her voice shook. He thought his father might still be out near the old logging road. Ethan froze. Caleb's father had died years earlier. The boy knew that. Yet storms had a way of making people act emotionally, especially children. He left hours ago. Panic flooded her voice. I couldn't find him. Before Ethan could answer, Ranger reacted. The dog spun toward the storm, alert, focused. His entire posture changed, the same way it had changed before every rescue. Ethan looked at him, then at Hannah. Which direction? The logging road. Ranger barked immediately, once, then twice, as if confirming it. The dog already knew. Without another word, Ranger charged into the blizzard. Ethan followed. Snow exploded around them. The storm seemed determined to stop them. But Ranger pushed forward relentlessly. The logging road lay nearly invisible beneath drifting snow. Trees bent beneath powerful winds. Darkness approached rapidly. Every minute mattered. Then Ranger stopped, abruptly. The dog lowered his nose to the ground, sniffed, moved forward, stopped again. A scent trail, despite the snow, despite the wind, despite impossible conditions. Ranger had found it. Hope surged through Ethan. The German Shepherd accelerated. 20 yards, 30, 50. Suddenly he barked. Loud, urgent. Ethan ran. His boots punched through deep snow. Branches whipped against his jacket. Then he saw it. A small figure, half buried near a fallen pine tree. Caleb. The boy wasn't moving. For one horrifying second, Ethan feared the worst. Then Caleb coughed, weakly, barely conscious. Relief hit so hard Ethan nearly staggered. Ranger reached the boy first. The dog immediately pressed against him, sharing warmth, protecting him from the wind, just as he had once protected Ethan. Tears filled Caleb's eyes as he recognized the dog. Ranger. The word barely escaped his lips. The German Shepherd licked his face gently, as if reassuring him, as if saying everything would be okay. For a moment, Ethan simply watched. Man, dog, child. 3 lives connected by a single act of loyalty. Then he lifted Caleb carefully into his arms. The boy was cold. Far too cold. They needed shelter. Immediately. The church was too far. The roads were impassable. There was only one place capable of keeping everyone safe. The tower. High above the valley. Hidden within the storm. The same tower everyone had mocked. And as Ethan turned toward the ridge with Caleb in his arms and Ranger leading the way, he realized the rescue mission was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The storm seemed determined to stop them. Snow blasted across the valley in violent waves. The wind howled through the trees with a sound that barely seemed natural. Each gust felt powerful enough to push a man off his feet. Yet Ranger continued moving. Forward. Always forward. The German Shepherd stayed several yards ahead, checking the path before turning back to make sure Ethan and Caleb were still following. The dog had become their compass, their guide, their lifeline. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness. His face remained pale, his lips trembled from the cold. Ethan held him tightly beneath his winter jacket, sharing as much warmth as possible. "Stay awake, buddy." Caleb nodded weakly. Ranger barked once, encouraging, as if he agreed. For nearly 40 minutes, they fought their way uphill toward the ridge. Progress came painfully slow. Snowdrifts reached waist height in some places. The old logging road had vanished completely. The landscape no longer resembled Montana. It resembled another world, a frozen world, a world ruled entirely by winter. Then Ranger stopped. The dog stood rigid, listening. Ethan froze immediately. Years of working together had created instincts stronger than words. If Ranger stopped, there was a reason. The wind briefly shifted, and through the storm came a sound, faint, distant, A cry for help. Ethan's stomach tightened. Not again. The sound came from somewhere near the frozen creek crossing east of town. A dangerous area even during normal weather. Now it was a trap. The cry came again, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. Someone alive. Caleb stirred in Ethan's arms. What was that? Ethan looked toward the ridge, then toward the creek. Every second mattered. The tower was close. Safety was close. But so was another life in danger. Ranger had already made his decision. The German shepherd turned toward the creek, without hesitation, without uncertainty. The mission wasn't finished. Ethan sighed. Of course. The dog barked once and started moving. Minutes later, they reached the creek. Or rather, where the creek should have been. Everything lay hidden beneath snow and ice. The water itself was invisible. Only Ranger seemed capable of navigating the terrain. The dog moved carefully, testing each step, watching constantly. Then they found him. A young ranch hand named Tyler Reeves, barely 20 years old. He had been trying to reach his family's livestock shelter when the storm overwhelmed him. Now he sat partially buried against a fallen tree, exhausted, freezing, terrified. Relief flooded his face when he saw them. Thank God. Ethan quickly assessed the situation. Tyler could still walk, barely, but moving him toward shelter immediately was critical. Within minutes, all four of them were heading toward the ridge. The group moved slowly, painfully. The storm seemed stronger than ever. Visibility dropped further. Darkness approached. Then disaster struck. It happened so fast Ethan almost missed it. 1 second Ranger was leading the way. The next second the dog vanished. A sharp crack echoed beneath the snow, followed instantly by a splash. The world seemed to stop. Ranger! Ethan dropped Caleb into Tyler's arms and rushed forward. The snow beneath his boots collapsed. A section of hidden creek ice had broken. Beneath it, freezing water churned violently, and Ranger was in it. The German shepherd struggled against the current. His front paws clawed desperately at the ice edge. The water pulled at him relentlessly. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Not Ranger, not him. Without hesitation, Ethan threw himself forward. The ice groaned, cracked but held barely. He stretched toward the dog. Come on, Ranger tried. Again. The freezing water dragged him backward each time. Ethan reached farther. Ignoring the danger, ignoring the cold, ignoring everything except the dog, their eyes met. For one terrifying moment, Ethan saw the same thing he had seen years earlier on that mountain overseas. Loss. The possibility of losing another partner, another teammate. Not again, never again. With a final desperate effort, Ethan grabbed Ranger's harness. The force nearly pulled him into the creek. Tyler immediately dropped beside him. Together they hauled, inch by inch, foot by foot. The German shepherd emerged from the water, shaking, gasping, alive. Ethan wrapped both arms around him. Relief hit like a physical blow. For several seconds neither moved. Snow swirled around them. The storm continued raging, but none of it mattered. Ranger was alive. That was enough for now. The reality became obvious almost immediately. The dog was injured. One rear leg showed signs of strain. His movements had become stiff. The freezing water had drained enormous amounts of body heat. Any normal dog would have stopped. Any normal dog would have needed carrying. Ranger wasn't normal. Minutes after the rescue, he struggled to his feet. Ethan frowned. No. The dog ignored him. Ranger limped forward, then looked back, waiting ready, still leading, still working, even injured. The sight left Tyler speechless. The young ranch hand stared at the dog in disbelief. He's still going? Ethan smiled sadly. That's Ranger. The journey resumed, slowly, painfully. Yet somehow the German shepherd remained in front. Every step clearly hurt, but he never quit, never complained, never hesitated. The storm had become a battle, and Ranger intended to finish it. As darkness settled fully across the valley, lights appeared ahead. The tower. Warm golden light glowed through narrow windows, a beacon in the storm. Hope, safety, survival. Tyler nearly cried when he saw it. Caleb smiled weakly. Even Ethan felt relief. Then Ranger stopped again. The dog turned toward the valley below, listening, watching. The expression on his face changed. The same expression Ethan had seen all day. Concern. The dog knew something. The storm wasn't finished with Cold Creek, not even close. Far below, dozens of families remained trapped inside freezing homes. Wood supplies continued shrinking. Generators continued failing. The worst temperatures had not yet arrived, and for the first time, Ethan realized the truth. The tower wasn't just his shelter anymore. It was becoming something else, something larger, something the entire town might soon need. Ranger seemed to understand that before anyone else. Even now, injured and exhausted, the dog continued watching the valley, protecting it, as if the people who mocked him were his responsibility too. The realization stayed with Ethan as they finally reached the tower entrance. The heavy door opened. Warm air spilled into the night, safety at last. Yet deep inside, Ethan knew the hardest part of the storm still lay ahead. And Ranger, despite everything he had already sacrificed, wasn't done saving people. Not yet. The moment the tower door closed behind them, the storm seemed to disappear. Not completely. The wind still roared outside. Snow still hammered against the stone walls. But inside, something remarkable happened. The chaos stopped. Warmth greeted them. Steady warmth. Gentle warmth. The kind that reached into frozen fingers and aching muscles. The kind that felt impossible after hours inside a blizzard. Tyler Reeves stared around the tower in disbelief. Caleb sat wrapped in blankets near the central hearth. His cheeks slowly regained color. The boy's eyes widened as he looked around. It's warm. Ethan nodded. The statement sounded simple. Yet after everything that had happened, it felt extraordinary. The fire in the center of the room wasn't large. Certainly not large enough to explain the temperature. The walls themselves seemed warm. The floor held warmth. Even the air felt different. Soft, stable, comfortable. The result of months of labor, months of ridicule, months of preparation, and now, for the first time, people were seeing it. Not as a strange tower, but as shelter, as safety, as hope. Meanwhile, Ranger collapsed near the hearth. The dog finally allowed himself to rest. Ethan immediately moved beside him, carefully examining the injured leg. The strain looked painful. The cold water exposure worried him more. Ranger's fur remained damp in places despite efforts to dry him. The German shepherd trembled slightly. Exhaustion had finally caught up. "You did enough." Ranger lifted his head. His eyes remained alert, still watching, still listening, still refusing to fully relax. Caleb crawled closer. The boy wrapped a blanket around the dog, then rested a hand gently against Ranger's neck. "Good boy." The German shepherd closed his eyes briefly, perhaps the first true moment of comfort he'd experienced all day. Outside, the storm intensified. Again, the tower shuddered beneath powerful gusts. Snow struck the walls like thrown gravel. Darkness swallowed everything beyond the narrow windows. Then came the knock. 3 heavy impacts against the door. Everyone froze. Ethan moved immediately. Ranger struggled to stand, even injured, even exhausted. The dog refused to let Ethan answer the door alone. When the door opened, freezing air rushed inside, along with 4 people, a ranching family, terrified, half-frozen, desperate. They had followed tracks through the snow, tracks left earlier by Ethan and Ranger. The family stumbled inside. Relief washed across their faces instantly. One woman began crying, not from fear, from gratitude. Warmth had never felt so valuable. Ethan found blankets. Tyler helped. Soon everyone sat near the hearth, safe. But the night wasn't finished. An hour later, another group arrived. Then another. Word had begun spreading through the valley. The tower on the ridge. The strange stone structure everyone mocked. The place that stayed warm. People came because they had no better option. Generators were failing. Wood piles were disappearing. Cabins were losing the battle. One family described ice forming inside their walls. Another spoke of frozen water buckets. Several admitted they had never experienced cold like this before. Each story sounded similar. The storm was winning. By midnight, more than 20 people occupied the tower. Every available space filled. Children, parents, ranchers, neighbors. People who had laughed at Ethan for months, now sitting inside the shelter he built. Nobody mentioned the irony. Nobody needed to. The truth hung in the air, visible, undeniable. The tower worked, and everyone knew it. Near one wall sat Hannah Brooks. She had arrived shortly after Caleb's rescue. The moment she saw her son alive, tears filled her eyes. For several minutes, she simply held him, unable to speak, unable to let go. Later, she crossed the room and found Ethan near the hearth. For a moment, neither said anything. Words seemed inadequate. Finally, she looked at Ranger. The injured dog lay surrounded by blankets. Caleb remained beside him, refusing to leave. "He saved my son." Ethan glanced toward the dog. "He found him." Hannah shook her head. "No." Her voice trembled slightly. "He saved him." Ethan didn't argue, because she was right. Across the room, another conversation unfolded. One Ethan never expected to hear. Mason Crowley sat beside the western wall, silent, watching. The builder looked exhausted. His face carried the expression of a man confronting uncomfortable truths. Hours earlier, his own cabin had begun failing. Despite constant fire, despite endless wood, the temperature kept dropping. Eventually, he made the decision he once swore he'd never make. He came to the tower. Now he sat surrounded by evidence. Warm walls, warm floors, comfortable air. Everything he claimed was impossible. Everything Ethan predicted. Reality had delivered its verdict. Yet Mason said nothing. Not yet. The silence inside the tower grew heavier as the night progressed. People listened to the storm outside. The sound never stopped. Wind, snow, cold, nature attacking relentlessly. Inside, children slept, parents whispered. Exhausted ranchers stared into the fire, and slowly something changed. The laughter disappeared. The judgment disappeared. The assumptions disappeared. People began seeing Ethan differently, not as the homeless veteran, not as the strange man on the ridge, but as the person who prepared when nobody else did. The person who tried to warn them. The person who built something that worked. Around 2 in the morning, the storm reached its peak. The temperature outside plunged to levels rarely seen in western Montana. Several people checked thermometers, then checked them again. The readings seemed impossible, yet they were real. The cold had become deadly. No one spoke after hearing the numbers. The room fell completely silent. The kind of silence created by shared understanding. Everyone knew what conditions like that meant. Without shelter, survival became uncertain. Without heat, danger arrived quickly. The realization settled over the tower like another blanket. Then came another surprise. The fire began shrinking. Slowly, naturally. The supply of burning wood decreased. No one rushed to add more immediately. Most were too tired, too exhausted, too emotionally drained. The flames lowered, then lowered again. Yet something strange happened. The room remained warm. Hours passed. The fire continued weakening. Still, the temperature remained stable. Several people noticed, including Mason. The builder touched one of the stone walls. Warm, not hot, warm. The wall itself held heat, stored it, released it slowly, exactly as Ethan claimed. Mason sat back down, quietly. The expression on his face had changed. Not disbelief anymore. Something closer to respect. Outside, the storm continued raging. Inside, nobody laughed, nobody argued, nobody questioned. The town had spent months judging both Ethan and Ranger. Now they sat alive because of them. That truth echoed louder than the storm itself. Near the hearth, Caleb eventually fell asleep beside Ranger. The boy's hand remained resting on the dog's shoulder. The German shepherd never moved away. Despite injury, despite exhaustion, despite everything, he remained exactly where he needed to be, protecting, watching, serving, just as he always had. And as the longest night Cold Creek had ever known continued beyond the stone walls, everyone inside began understanding the same lesson. Preparation looked foolish right up until the moment it became necessary. And on this night, necessity had arrived. Just before dawn, the storm finally began to weaken. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The change was subtle. The wind no longer screamed quite as loudly. The tower no longer trembled beneath every gust. And somewhere beyond the stone walls, the first traces of morning waited patiently behind the clouds. Inside, most of Cold Creek slept. Children rested beneath blankets. Parents leaned against warm stone walls. Exhausted ranchers dozed beside the hearth. The long night had taken everything they had. Only a few remained awake. Ethan was one of them. So was Mason Crowley, and so was Ranger. The German shepherd still lay near the hearth, wrapped in blankets, his injured leg stretched carefully beside him. The dog looked exhausted, yet every so often his ears twitched. Listening, always standing watch. Caleb slept nearby with one hand resting on Ranger's shoulder. Neither had moved for hours. The sight quietly touched everyone who noticed it. The boy who had been saved, the dog who had saved him. Outside, winter still raged. Inside, peace had finally arrived. For a while, then something unexpected happened. The fire died, not all at once. Slowly, the flames shrank lower, then lower. Eventually, only glowing coals remained. Nobody rushed forward to add more wood. Most people were asleep. Others were simply too tired. The room grew quieter. The hearth darkened. The final flames disappeared. And everyone waited. Because even after everything they had witnessed, old habits remained. A fire dies. A room becomes cold. That was how winter worked. That was what everyone believed. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The tower remained warm. Another hour passed, still warm. People slowly began waking, confused, curious. Several touched the walls. Others touched the floor. The stone still radiated heat. Stored heat. Patient heat. The kind Ethan had tried explaining for months. The kind nobody believed until now. Mason stood and walked slowly around the room. His hand traced the curved interior wall. Warm, not slightly warm. Comfortably warm, despite the dead fire, despite the brutal cold outside. The realization hit him harder than any argument ever could. Because numbers didn't care about pride. Reality didn't care about opinions. The tower had passed its final test. By sunrise, the storm had weakened enough for people to step outside. The sight that greeted them was breathtaking. Cold Creek lay buried beneath snow. Drifts reached rooftops, roads had vanished, fences disappeared. The valley looked transformed. As though winter had erased the familiar world and replaced it with another. People stared silently. The scale of the storm finally became clear. Then they turned back toward the tower. Toward the structure that had protected them. Toward the man who built it. Toward the dog who led them there. No one laughed anymore. No one mocked. No one doubted. The mountain had delivered its verdict. Later that morning, rescue crews finally began reconnecting parts of the valley. Roads reopened slowly. Generators were repaired. Families returned home. Yet something fundamental had changed. The town that walked into the storm was not the town that emerged from it. Several days later, when normal life slowly returned, Mason Crowley drove up the ridge alone. The sky had cleared. Fresh snow sparkled beneath sunlight. The mountains looked peaceful again, almost innocent. The builder parked his truck and walked toward the tower. Ethan was outside splitting firewood. Ranger rested nearby. His leg had improved significantly, not perfect, but healing. The dog immediately recognized Mason. For months that would have meant tension. Now it meant nothing. Ranger simply watched, calm, patient. Mason stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence felt strangely familiar. Finally, Mason cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Ethan leaned the axe against a log. Mason continued. "I spent months telling people you were wrong." The builder looked toward the tower, then back toward Ethan. "I wasn't just wrong," he smiled faintly. "I was stubborn." Ethan said nothing. Mason nodded. "I thought I understood winter." A long pause followed. Then he asked the question nobody expected. "Will you teach me?" Ethan looked surprised. "Teach you what?" "Everything." Mason glanced toward the tower again. The walls, the floor, the heat storage, the design. The builder shook his head. "I want to learn." For several moments, Ethan simply stared, then he smiled. A real smile. One not shadowed by old memories. One not interrupted by pain. "Okay." That single word changed everything. Spring arrived slowly that year. Snow retreated from the valley. Roads reopened completely. Grass returned. Life resumed. Yet Cold Creek never forgot the winter, or the tower, or Ranger. Construction projects began appearing throughout the community. Stone thermal walls, improved foundations, heat-retaining designs, emergency shelters. People adapted. They learned. They prepared. Not because someone forced them, because they witnessed what worked. Mason became Ethan's strongest supporter. Several ranchers followed his example. Within 2 years, fuel consumption across the valley dropped significantly during winter. Families spent less money, burned less wood, stayed warmer. The lesson spread. Just as knowledge always does when survival proves its value. Then came the project nobody expected. The community shelter, built near the center of town, inspired directly by Ethan's tower, large enough to protect dozens of families during emergencies, strong enough to survive severe storms, warm enough to save lives. When construction finished, the town invited Ethan to attend the dedication ceremony. At first, he refused. Then Hannah convinced him. So one bright summer morning, Ethan arrived with Ranger beside him. The entire town gathered. Children, ranchers, teachers, neighbors, people who once laughed, people who once doubted, people whose lives had been changed. The mayor stepped forward, then unveiled the final surprise. A carved wooden statue, life-sized, beautifully detailed, standing beside the shelter entrance. A German shepherd. Ranger. The crowd applauded. Several people wiped away tears. Caleb smiled the widest. The boy ran forward and wrapped his arms around the real dog. Ranger accepted the attention with quiet dignity, as if none of this surprised him, as if helping people had always been the plan. Perhaps it had. That evening, after the ceremony ended, Ethan climbed the ridge alone with Ranger. The sun dipped behind the Bitterroot Mountains. Golden light spread across the valley. Cold Creek glowed below. Peaceful, safe, home. For a long time, neither moved. Finally, Ethan sat beside the tower. The same tower everyone once mocked. The same tower that saved them. Ranger settled beside him. The dog rested his head against Ethan's shoulder. The familiar gesture carried years of history, years of loyalty, years of survival. Below them, lights appeared throughout town. Families gathering for dinner, children playing, life continuing. Ethan watched quietly, then smiled. Not because he finally had a house, not because the town respected him, not because they built a statue. Those things mattered, but not as much as this. For the first time since the war, he felt something he thought had been lost forever. Peace, real peace. The kind that arrives when a person finally stops running from the past. The kind that arrives when they discover they still belong somewhere. The wind moved gently across the ridge. The mountains stood silent, and beside him sat the friend who never gave up. The friend who pulled him through nightmares, through storms, through loneliness, through loss. The town once believed survival came from bigger fires and larger wood piles. Ethan and Ranger taught them something different. That true strength comes from preparation, that wisdom matters more than pride, and that loyalty, real loyalty, can save far more than a single life. As darkness settled over Cold Creek, the tower remained standing against the fading sky. A monument not to stone, not to engineering, not even to survival, but to trust. The trust between a man and his dog, a bond strong enough to weather any storm. If you believe loyalty and preparation still matter, comment 1 below. And if you've ever had a dog that stood by you through hard times, comment Ranger. Sometimes the people who get laughed at today are the ones who save everyone tomorrow. And if you enjoy stories about courage, dignity, and never giving up in the land of the free, subscribe and join us for the next story.